Hello, music lovers. Welcome back. A few of you left me some great feedback on the organic house ingredients video. Some to the effect of, this isn't my genre, but I found it extremely helpful. Please do other genres. And some more of you were asking for a sound design breakdown on the Stutter House video, asking how I made all those sounds. So, given that half the battle of sound design is being able to recognize or just name the sounds that you're hearing, I figured we'd kill two birds with one stone, as it were, by doing Stutter House ingredients and sound design. Let's go. Okay, so just a quick overview. If you haven't seen the first video on Stutter House, that was going over the effect and the various ways to achieve it. This is the kind of sound we're talking about. Call it gating, volume envelopes, or stuttering, doesn't matter. The effect is so prominent in a certain corner of house music that it's now claimed its own subgenre. I studied around 10 different references for the video. About 6 or 7 of those made it into the video in the form of quick remakes. And although they are all technically house, underneath we have quite a range of flavors, with tempos ranging from 120 to 132, straight tracks, swung tracks, some bouncing, some rolling. Lots to dig into. Regardless, breaking down all of those references has given me a nice little overview as to the ingredients, which I'll be breaking down into simple categories of drums, bass, pads, and vocals. Those 4 stems are the essentials. I do have a group here for leads, but most tracks didn't use them, so I don't consider that essential to the genre. This is the trigger track. If you want to know what that's all about, you'll have to watch the previous video on how to achieve the Stutter House effect. And this group is just cymbals and noise, nothing specific to this genre. So let's dive in. Okay, drums. Hopefully you saw my house drums tutorial. Thank you to all that did, by the way. It's reached over 100,000 now. Thank you. This is very much the same deal. I'm not trying to match the reference precisely. Instead, we have one overall drum kit, which is manipulated in little ways to match the essential vibe and groove of the original reference. You'll see what I mean as we go. Start with the Chainsmokers' Fall. Track sounded like this. We're at 129 BPM here. The original was actually at 122, but most of the references were around 129, so I've kept the session there. The slower tempo makes more sense, given that they are on the more pop end of the spectrum of dance music, but it is a strong example of Stutter House. Regarding the drums, it's just straight pop house. Fairly straightforward. Now, by the way, I've used the same kick for all of these remakes. It's manipulated slightly here and there to get closer to the reference. Here is our kick drum. For claps, I have 2 layered here. Kind of a messy one, and a more traditional 909. You'll hear those get manipulated in various ways, length, pitch, depending on what kind of backbeat accent we need. Again, see my drums tutorial if you need more. Got some light hi-hats here. Those are for the offbeat. We also have this very light top loop. Then we have some hi-hats on 16ths, nice and bright from an 808. Running this accent pattern. And a shaker. This groove is pretty much entirely straight, and it's largely the 16th notes on the hats and shakers driving this. No heavy accents on the offbeat hi-hats or the backbeat. Next up, we have Free Jack's Sol del Serra. Original track at 130 BPM. More into traditional bumpy house territory here. That's partly to do with the bass groove, but here's our drums. So this is the same kick drum, but I've bumped the pitch slightly via an envelope just to give it a little bit more chest. Nothing essential, just something to bring it closer to the reference. You'll hear the backbeat accent is much heavier on this one because we have reverb on the claps. And also I've turned up that clap layer, the messy one. Hi-hats. Much heavier accent on the offbeat now. Same top loop. Just gluing the whole thing together. In fact, you can see it's appropriately named glue. Pretty sure CPR means it's from the defected pack called Copyright. 16s are still here, but very light. Those have taken a back seat now. They're not driving the groove, they're just filling in. Then we have Otto Nose with Rosa. Or should I say my version of it anyway, with a completely different vocal. This groove is very swung. You can see our groove amount in the top left here. All the parts in this session were set to be able to swing. As you can see, 45% swing. So this whole session is set up so that I can adjust the total amount of swing across all parts using that groove amount in the top left, where 0 means we are straight and 100% means we are using all of that 45% swing template. So we're 91% of 45% swing. Hope that makes sense. Groove-wise, very different to Free Jack. Our kick has had another adjustment to the pitch envelope, going higher in pitch but quicker, so we get a little click at the beginning. Again, all just trying to match the reference a little bit more. Claps in this groove are much shorter. If you listen versus the Free Jack, you can see I've changed the start point to miss all of that initial build-up on the clap, and we're also very dry. So it's not a very strong backbeat accent at all, very tight. For the hi-hats, light offbeats. We're not using the long offbeat hi-hats for this one. Again, much tighter groove overall. Now, a lot of the swing is coming from this broken up break. This is a break from one of my favorite packs called Vintage Breaks. This one is, VB6 Vintage Breaks 6 by Sample Magic. I got Ableton to slice it up for me into all the individual hits, and then picking a few and just placing them to mimic the reference. So that's given us lots of syncopation, lots of skippy groove. Here's our 16th hi-hats, but they're swung now. Here's how they sounded straight. Swung. And the shaker is back, obviously swung too. Compare that to the straight shaker. Swung. Shuffling along nicely. Altogether sounding like... That's Otto Nose. You can hear we're not too far away from garage with that one. Okay, then we have Silk Quiver. So we're back to straight groove. But instead of the more classic house pattern like the free jack track, this has more of the skippy kind of groove like the Otto knows, but this time straight. So normal kick. Claps fairly tight. I've also added an extra percussion part using the clap by making it very short and pitching it down. Again, something I just pulled from the vibe of the reference. Our offbeat hi-hats are fairly strong. We have some extra syncopation from some high-pitched snares. Also very garage-esque. And we have some more skips coming from the break. And our 16s. And altogether, that sounds like. Then we have Desco with Ascend. This one's also straight, but a different groove again, as this one is a tom-led groove. Adding a little bump. So kick is normal. Tom. Pretty dry, short claps. Fairly light offbeat hi-hats. Our usual rolling 16s. Because that matches the pattern of the synth. Shaker also doing the same thing. Heavily shortened to keep the groove tight. Here's what they would sound like longer. Also, to accent the synth 16s, we have the hi-hat from 909. So we have the thicker hi-hat of the 909 underneath the thin, brighter hi-hat of the 808. And the shakers for extra sizzle. All on that 16th pattern. Okay, so this track didn't actually end up in the video. I wasn't sure it qualified as Stutter House. It may have been a precursor though, and it was part of my early reference research anyway. It's Fred again and the Blessed Madonna. We've Lost Dancing. I'm glad I researched that one early though, because it was that track that made me reach for the break, which has come in handy for most of the other grooves, for those syncopated accents. Here's our drum groove. So we're swinging again. There's a little tom bump in there too. And as you can hear, most of this is driven by that break. So, normal kick. Here's our tom bump. Medium claps. Fairly light on the offbeat hi-hat. syncopated skip snares to back up the break. And as you can hear, the break is doing a lot of the work. That's turned up. Speaking of breaks and stutter effects, this might not be classed as a house groove, but biceps glue is certainly in the conversation. This one's fairly simple. I swapped the kick to an 808, just Ableton's built-in one. Clap on 2 and 4. And the break returns. And that's everything from the bicep groove. Okay, bass. We could split these into about 3 different types. The first type is the pad bass. Doing the long sustained stuff. Then we have the rolling basses. Basically on some kind of 16th note groove. Here's another. Then we have these more classic house basses, the bouncy kind. And this one. That you might call a little more UK style. Let me talk you through the important bits of the sound design. Let's look at the pad. Those who know me well by now will have guessed I have made all these in Vital. And if you're new to this, know that Vital is free. It's basically free serum with a better interface. For the pad, here we have 2 saw waves. One is an octave up, like this. They are detuned with unison, and that's backed up by a sine wave, which is pure, it's not detuned. We do this because detuning waveforms, whilst sounding great, is actually very bad for low frequency consistency, so not good for bass patches. Let me take out this sine wave and I'll show you what happens if we only had detuned oscillators. See our lowest subfrequency going up and down here? That's a result of something called phase cancellation, which detuning oscillators will introduce. So we add a single sine wave back at the lowest fundamental frequency, not detuned, and fixed in phase, or in other words, making sure it triggers the same every time. That should shore up our bottom end. Like that. So we have the detune for aesthetics and the sub for solidity. Now this is mostly just for this demo. If you saw my bass processing video, you'll know I like to put the sub on a separate track so we can sidechain it separately. Useful to know regardless. Let's look at the filter. Everything's filtered down. Kept low because this is more of a subtle roll, but you can automate this for interest and aggression. But most of the references I studied were pretty chill. I used that in the Fred Again remake. Also in the Desco track. And Bicep sometimes have one in their track as well. As you can see from the MIDI, nothing too surprising, just holding long notes. All of the references I studied had moving chord progressions, and the bass is our biggest clue to that. In the case of bicep here, we are 1, 7, 5, 6 in E minor. Let's have a quick look at the Des chord progression. That's a 6, 1, 7, 4 in G sharp minor. And fret again is 6, 7, 1, 3 in F minor. Onto the rolling basses like Otto knows. Here we have a mixture of a couple of waves, almost a saw wave here, blended with a triangle from Vital's built-in waveforms, combined with a more analog saw. This is taken from the free Echo Soundworks pack. It says it's from an ARP synth, presumably taken from the classic ARP 2600. Worth exploring if you're after a little more character than the pure digital waveforms. Very, very short envelope, as you can see here. Let's zoom into that. Filter is also being triggered by an envelope. And then we have a very, very short spike of an envelope to give us a little bit more attack. Here's without. Adds a little tick at the beginning. You might ask, why not just send more of this envelope? You could program a more complicated envelope shape, but I find it easier just to have one do the spike, which leaves the other one free to do the low-mid punch. There's no wrong or right way, as long as you know what type of shape you're looking for. I'm also using envelope 2 to add a little white noise. Again, all to help the attack of the sound. As for effects, as you can see, we're just running a little bit of distortion, the soft clipper, and we have an EQ for some mid-poke. Now, just to be clear, if you are ever wondering why I choose certain frequencies or bandwidths or filter cutoff points, anything like that, just know it's simply because right here at the top of my screen, there's the reference. This is why we reference. There's no big secrets. I'm just trying to get towards that. Yes, I have been doing this for a while now, so I have some clues ahead of time, but the process is still the same. We listen to the reference, and it's trial and error time until we get close. The only difference between you and me is time. Like all things, sound design is no different. I can do this a little bit faster because I've already heard and got used to what a saw wave sounds like, or a saw wave under a filter. Practice that enough, and guess what? You also start getting ideas for your own sound. Win-win. Anyways, back to the bass. Apologies for my rant tangents. Let's look at the MIDI, because the sound design goes hand in hand with the performance. So this bass doesn't actually have any audio stutter effect on it. This is all achieved by just using short notes and making sure the synth patch has short release. Not too short though, or else we introduce these clicks. So in other words, as short as you can get without the clicking artifact. And then we just have note length to consider. For you Ableton users that haven't looked inside the MIDI effects folder for a while, this is something you can automate with the note length plugin. Useful sometimes. Moving on to the silk bass. It sounds like it's playing those rolling 16ths, but as you can see, these are long notes. The effect is coming from the triggering of our filter from this MIDI envelope. As you can see, the MIDI for this is 16s of slightly varying velocities and lengths for groove. The strongest one being the third, which is the offbeat, the same place your hi-hat would typically fall. So that's being used to trigger this macro on our bass sound. The macro, of course, just being a knob that can turn several knobs at once. In this case, it's playing with our filter and our envelope shape, sustain in this case. So now when we play with the trigger envelope, it can affect the shape of all the triggered stutter effects across all the parts. Listen to what it does to our bass. Shorten the decay. Etc. As for the sound itself, you'll eventually get an ear for this, but this kind of grindy bass sound, I want to call it, this typically isn't achieved with basic waveforms like saws and squares, unless they're run through very complex distortions. But usually it's just from a more complex type of waveform. Now it's quite subtle here because the filter is low, but if we open this up, as you might be able to hear, these more complex waveforms are approaching bass house dubstep vibes. It is backed up by a saw wave, however, as saw waves have a very solid harmonic structure. Let me show you on the analyzer. That even harmonic structure is very good for recognizing bass notes on small speakers, whereas the complex waveforms are very uneven and unpredictable. As you can hear, that one is less strong in the bass, but that's providing our character. That's why we have them both. I have these phase locked, so each note pressed is the same. And just like we did with the bass pad, there's a single sine wave backing up our lowest frequencies. Again, only really for these little quick remakes. Normally I would have a separate subtrack, see my bass processing video if you need to know more. As for effects, you'll notice very similar to the other one, we have some soft clipping, and then a little bit of EQ to provide some top bark. Don't let this envelope distract you, it's not actually connected to anything. But this is the kind of thing you might do if you were not using an external trigger. Again, check out my earlier Stutter House video if you want to know why I would make that decision. Future Ben here, I forgot to mention the chord progression, just in case anyone was wondering. Otto knows is in D sharp major, and the progression is 4, 1, 6, 5. And the silk track, the envelope triggered bass, that's C sharp major, and it's a 1, 4, 6, 4. So interestingly, both the rolling bass examples were in major keys. It's a small sample size, could be just coincidence. Or maybe the rolling bass in a Stutter House context lends itself more to happier vibes, maybe. Onto the more traditional house bass, here's the free jack one. So this one's not rolling, this one's bouncing. This classic pattern is a 3-3-2. 2 lots of 3/16 long, and then 2/16 long. 3-3-2. Sometimes called tresillo or habanera rhythm. Notice the different note lengths here, slightly elongated on the first bar. That's a groove thing. Also, the first note being longer helps it be audible after the sidechain ducking. Let me show you the really extreme example so you can hear the groove change. That kind of thing. The power of note lengths, everyone. Always to be judged in context, of course, though. I'm working to a reference here. Let's look at the sound. Nothing too complicated. We have a couple of square waves and a triangle wave. Square waves have a very different sound to saw waves. That's due to their more open harmonic structure. Let me show you on the analyzer. Notice how far apart the harmonics are versus a saw wave. The biggest noticeable difference being the first harmonic. Saws have this octave, whereas squares don't have that octave. Their first harmonic is a fifth above the octave. If you're trying to make classic sounds, by the way, the older synths only had squares and saws and sines. So, a great place to start if you're trying to get those old school vibes. The second square wave here is one octave up. This is another one of those aesthetic choices, as this is kind of forming the top character of the bass. Instead of using a pure square wave, I've grabbed one out of the Echo Soundworks analog pack. Again, from the classic ARP 2600 synth, I presume. It's got a slightly mellower, woodier sound than a pure digital square. Then our third wave, this triangle, that's involved in a little bit of FM synthesis. This is being frequency modulated by oscillator 1. Let's have a listen. A very classic noise. Without FM. And that's what happens when you multiply it by another waveform. In our case, the octave up square. Classic sound. And the low square brings us our bottom end. Here's everything together. Filter on a spiky envelope, as usual, with a little bit of resonance this time. Because the bass in the reference, I could hear a little bit of bubble, as it were. We also have a little bit of envelope being sent to the drive on the soft clipper. One of many ways to get a little bit more punch. Again, EQ'd to the reference. Apparently it was lacking in this harmonic. You can safely ignore this low shelf EQ. Again, that's just here for the remake. Having a separate subtrack would make that redundant. For the record, if your bass is moving notes, I do not recommend EQing the low end. Because it's all dependent on the key and the notes. You will end up catching some notes more than others, and you're going to end up with a very uneven low end to your track. Oh, before I forget, you may have spotted this effect on some of the basses. It's my stereo faker. It was explained in the bass processing video, and I gave it away in my free racks video. It's just here to add a little bit of mono-safe width for basses that don't have any natural means of creating width, like detune, for example. Lastly, the UK style-ish bass from the Chainsmokers. As you can see, only 2 sine waves, but it doesn't sound like it because this is an FM patch. You can see we're frequency modulating here. Let me take all this off so you can hear this without FM. So there's what your sine wave sounds like. And if we start to frequency modulate, classic. Now you're also hearing a little click at the beginning of the sound. That's coming from this envelope spike. That's very short and it's being sent to pitch. So our oscillators here are going up a few octaves just for a little microsecond, giving us that little tick and attack at the beginning. And we're also sending that envelope to the filter, so it lets the high frequencies through just for that tick. And then for extra aggression, we're using the internal multiband compressor, being fed by this mid spike. This compressor is basically OTT built into Vital. We also have some drive and some chorus. Bit of delay, but you'll notice most of the character is coming from the bounce off the reverb. And let's not forget a bit of white noise. Everything going through the filter, of course. Little bit of resonance. Without. With. Quite subtle. So between the FM, the pitch spike, and the white noise, we can get that bounce out of the reverb. And that's very much a lot of the character of this bass. Again, this is not exactly the same as the reference, it's just close in vibe. This is a preset I'd already made a while ago when I was working on some UK pop house. If I remember rightly, Joel Corry was the reference, so it's no accident that this fits the bill. Okie dokie, that's all we have time for this week. I'm hoping to upload part 2 on Friday. We'll go over the pads, chords, vocals, and how I went about making this intro-outro track here. As always, I hope you learned something. If you did, you know what to do. Press some buttons for me, or leave me a comment. Or if you're feeling extra generous, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description. And until next week, I'll see you in the comments. Bye-bye!